Right, okay, so welcome to our panel on the Good Friday Agreement. We've got 35 minutes to discuss this, and the way I'm going to do this is split this really into two. The first is going to be, I'm going to have a discussion with our two panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions or points from the floor in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. So first of all, if I could welcome our two panelists. To my immediate right is Paul Bew, who is a historian at Queen's University, Belfast, a professor of Irish politics, as well as being a crossbench member of the House of Lords, historic advisor to the Bloody Sunday Inquiry, 1998 to 2001, and other really important roles in relation to the political background in Northern Ireland and on the whole island of Ireland. And also Cathal Lee, who is the Associate Director at Instinctive Partners, with an F, Instinctive Partners in Dublin, who's a former political advisor in the Irish Parliament. He doesn't speak for the Irish government, but I'm hoping he could perhaps speak to their perspective and also other perspectives in the South. So I thought we'd kick off by Paul. Can you take us through, for somebody like me, as a UK parliamentarian who's sort of come in and out of Northern Ireland, can you just take us back 21 years, first of all, to the Good Friday Agreement? You played a central role in it. Can you just take us back? I realise we've only got 35 minutes, but take us back to the process and perhaps give it some of its perspective and importance and enduring importance of the agreement.
Well, first of all, let me say that I think one of the very, very important things about the report today is the way it stresses the importance of protecting the Good Friday Agreement. If I could explain, it's a slightly more complicated document than some people apparently think, particularly as the doctrine of consent to be found within it. But when I first read, if I can leap forward immediately, the withdrawal agreement, I immediately was surprised by something, and it's this, that in the withdrawal agreement on issues, for reasons I completely understand, by the way, and respect, that the UK, for example, loses its automatic recognition as a veterinary reference labs once we leave loses its automatic EU recognition once we leave the EU. There are provisions in there for animal health, broadly in agriculture, which are laid down as functions of the backstop. And that's why it has happened. It's an automatic, it is a kind of, in one way, a logical response to the change in the status of UK veterinary labs, so that the EU, which tests potentially sick cattle in Northern Ireland. There is a problem with this, which is that the Good Friday Agreement explicitly states, and I've brought it with me, that North-South cooperation, it begins right at the beginning, what's going to be done with under North animal health. The original approach, so you see the backstop appropriating a function which was originally here. Now, if it was a short-term emergency, that wouldn't be a problem. If there was a time limit, one wouldn't get too excited about this. But at the moment, there is no time limit. And it is appropriating functions, and if you read it carefully, the backstop tends to appropriate functions that were agreed, and I can read out the list, and I brought it with me, anyone wants to check it with me afterwards, to be done by North-South cooperation. And this relates to Peter Foster's point, because the doctrine of consent is actually very complicated, the Good Friday Agreement. For one thing, by the way, unionists have to consent to unite Ireland if a majority in Northern Ireland votes for it. That's part of the doctrine of consent in the agreement. It is quite true, as has been mentioned, there's a doctrine of consent that Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom until that happens. But it also quite explicitly says that North-South cooperation is dependent on the explicit endorsement of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Now, what you see here, and the reason why it struck me so forcibly is that in 1998, 1999, what we were struggling to do was to persuade a unionist community which disliked or was frightened by the idea of an Irish dimension, that there were these practical things that you could do. Who could complain about agreeing to cooperate on animal health? I mean, these are not ideological threats to anybody and sensible things to do in the island of Ireland. And this was part of the argument which led to a breakthrough at that point. And eventually, enough unionists accepted, well, there are all these pragmatic things we can do, and we need to have some kind of Irish dimension to this. So, strangely enough, the withdrawal agreement, while claiming to be protecting the Good Friday Agreement, and let me say, the letter, the Juncker letter of the 5th of December this year goes further. It says it will not affect it in any way. That's a very high bar, which is the EU has committed itself to. Actually strips out functions. On a temporary basis, in an emergency, perhaps so we sort out as maybe happening, common recognition of veterinary provisions, of veterinary agencies. What you could live with that, but there's nothing explicitly temporary about this. So there is a problem. The doctrine of consent is not, as Peter Foster defined it earlier, and quite explicitly in the text talks about the necessary explicit endorsement of the Northern Ireland Assembly for North-South arrangements. It's very important to understand that's a fundamental misreading. The narrow definition of consent is not the right one. It's not the doctrine to be found in the Good Friday Agreement. And in that sense, there is a tension with the withdrawal agreement. And as I say, the reason why it struck me so forcibly is that unlike the people who wrote the withdrawal agreement, I was actually there in 1998, 1999, and I remember the discussions. And I remember UK officials going up to us and saying, oh, this is a pragmatic area. For goodness sake, stop these people getting so excited about cooperation. Let's focus on this sort of area. By the way, British-Irish Council, also in the Good Friday Agreement, which has not been used, and another example of the way I think we've got a long way from the Good Friday Agreement. The British-Irish Council is described as something that deals with the totality of relations within these islands, and again, explicitly mentions agricultural issues, and in fact, not used. So the one thing you cannot say about the provision about the Good Friday Agreement is that it is based on a single model of consent, or that the institutional relationships can be described the way that they have. That briefly is my answer to how I see how my involvement in 1998, 1999 affects my involvement today.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Kyle.
To follow on from Paul's point, what Paul outlined as his thinking at the time for the Good Friday Agreement is not my understanding of why I voted for it. And that perhaps is the incredible complexity that it managed to sort. Because my desire, and I campaigned for that agreement, it was my first foray into politics in 1998 was campaigning for that agreement, and at no point did I think it was dealing with veterinary issues or to deal with areas of mutual competency. To me, it was dealing with an intractable political issue that would ultimately lead to peace and a time when somebody like Paul and I would sit on a shared platform together. Because truthfully, let's be honest, Paul and I would not have met outside the conditions that the Good Friday Agreement have facilitated. So while a lot of the discussion has been on technical, regulatory and indeed economic matters, you can't measure the human interactions, the glue that holds communities together. The photograph earlier of the two hands, I don't know if everyone could see it because it was on the screen. To put that in context, that sits at the, I'll be politically correct, that sits along the Foyle River, which sits in the Foyle constituency in the city of Derry, the city of Londonderry, Dirra, or whatever you wish to call it. But that handshaking, or that symbolism, to me, is almost a paragraph or a chapter in this document. Because when you look at the trade north-south, it doesn't bear relations with the trade between Birmingham and London. When you look at trade east-west, it doesn't look at it's no comparison with the City of London and the financial markets that exist here. However, the UK government, your Prime Minister, on behalf of the government, signed an agreement that Paul thought one thing and I thought the other, and that was perhaps the success of it, that was registered with the United Nations. That agreement must be read first, not second, in the context of the withdrawal agreement. And that is a point that is consistently missed by those here in London. This morning, and I won't name who said it to me because I would not wish to embarrass them, but they chastised me and they said, "You're probably over here to tell us that we're bold boys and we're not good Europeans." And I said, well, in truth, we're neighbours. And we weren't good neighbours, let's be truthful. We were not good neighbours for years. But if your neighbour's house is on fire, or your neighbour's shop is on fire, you don't take advantage of that situation by blocking the fire brigade to come. But similarly, if you see your neighbour then throwing some petrol onto the fire that is in their facility, it would give you rise to the question: is the right political response being adopted? I'm purely looking at it from Dublin, and as I said, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, nor never would. But there is a view that the political response to the June 2016 vote has not been as mature, and that's my polite form of words, has not been as mature as perhaps required the European Union and everyone to sit down together. Now, people have mentioned a new Prime Minister coming in. Does that change the context? It doesn't change the context in Dublin. And from what we were being told, it doesn't change the context from within the European Council. I mean, Donald Tusk was very clear that this 6-month period is not designed to facilitate political change in London. It's designed for you to carefully reflect upon the existing agreement. So that's just to give you some context for where we are and the view from Dublin.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Can you just remind us? I printed off the agreement again a couple of months ago, and can you just remind us what it says about the border in the agreement, and not just the Irish border, but also what it might or may not say about potential borders between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, or indeed if it says anything about the border between Ireland and Great Britain.
Well, there's the three strands which Paul can speak to: the internal aspect, the east-west, and then the north-south relations. And in a strange way, the complexity that is in your hands here, or is before the Parliament, for the British Parliament, is how do we deal with our political desire to leave, expressed in the will of the people, and a parliamentary desire to kick the can down the road. So when you have that situation, it's actually covered in the Good Friday Agreement. The people of Northern Ireland are the only sovereign entity in relation to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. Am I right, Paul?
Yes, that's perfectly correct.
Okay, so when you stand back and look at this, the people of Northern Ireland, and you will have heard on the fringes Sinn Féin call for a unity poll, because they see this as an opportunity, to perhaps consider a poll on unity. It would be a misguided vote at the moment, but the internal decision of the people of Northern Ireland is for them to decide their constitutional status. So that's sitting there as an unresolved issue. Never mind the Brady Amendment, never mind the withdrawal agreement, the political agreement. That sits there as a UN treaty agreed between two sovereign governments in 1998, and that is universally recognised. The Irish government proposed to the Irish people in 1998 to change our constitution, which we did to facilitate that very thing. So it is the piece that is missing in all the conversations, as far as I can see and as far as people in Dublin can see.
Okay. I'm going to ask you both whether you think that the proposals today, not just the SPS ones, but overall, conform with the Good Friday Agreement. If you've not had a chance to read all 202 pages, I'll take that as a perhaps slightly caveated. But from what you know about them, Paul, what would you say?
No, I think that the it's very clear that a very serious effort has been made from day one with this body of work to respect the Good Friday Agreement. And it's very, very important to understand this. You're quite right to mention the United Nations, but there's one area where, there are two things I perhaps should say. There is some skepticism in the report. It acknowledges the extent to which there is an island economy in agri-food and so on, and there is a partial type of, you can make that sort of case. But broadly speaking, it's very hard to argue that there is an island economy in the sense normally maybe two economies functioning on totally different rhythms. When the Dublin crashed, it virtually very little effect in the north. When it happened, it's an obvious little tester. Basically, the Northern Irish economy depends on the UK's intervention, and the Irish economy depends on brilliant success in FDI, with taxation deals with the European Union. So it's increasingly questioning, but nonetheless a brilliant success. But there are different heartbeats, really. And so we do say things in the report which are skeptical of, not totally accepting of terms that are in the withdrawal agreement. But there is absolutely nothing in the report which is contradictory to the Good Friday Agreement. And by the way, the Good Friday Agreement does not support an island economy. It's very important to understand that. It's absolutely just doesn't do it. End of story. But on the other question, just while we've talked about United Nations security resolutions, this is important as well on checks and so on. It came up in the earlier question. It's not para 43, by the way. It's 42, 43, I think. But not para 45, 43. But I know what you're referring to. There are a number of things. It's in a slightly ambiguous sense. It says the overarching intention is to not have a hard border. And then it says no infrastructure and no related checks. Now, one possible reading of that is no checks related to the infrastructure won't be there anyway. You could say that's unreasonable because we've said no hard border, and that governs the concept of the sentence. That would be, I think, a reasonable reply. But we have had, if we're serious about the United Nations documents, since 2001, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373, supported both by the British government as a permanent member and the Irish government, which was a temporary member, and I'm sure solemnly supports this, and it says in the event of borders, particularly tricky ones like the Irish border where there's smuggling, terrorism, still is terrorism-related activity, you must have effective border controls. Nobody has thought, quote unquote, nobody has thought that effective border controls since 2001 constitute a hard border. They do not equal a hard border. Everybody has lived with that. Nobody has suggested for a minute that while we accept this in the United Nations Security Council resolution, that is a hard border. And my reason for saying this is, but it seems to be impossible to have effective border controls if you say that even checks 20 miles from the border, 30 miles to the borders. I remember when Hans raised it talking about Rotterdam, that and it's well important to talk about this because the way a lot of United Kingdom citizens think about this is that they've been faced with a catch-22. You must not pollute the single market. We accept that. But the normal means by which you might stop the single market being polluted, which is by checks, you're not allowed either because that will reignite the war. Now, that ignores the fact that there are two routes back to violence and all that. I don't think it's going to happen in any circumstance, but there are two routes, not just Republican, but also routes that could arise out of loyalist alienation, right? But the fundamental thing is that you have a commitment on both sides, which seems to be totally compatible with the idea that some form of checks could be held. And if we pass the law saying it's illegal to pollute the single market, which part of me thinks would be a good idea, then we could actually enforce it in some sort of way, to put it very simply.
I'm going to ask Carol just to add anything, and I'm going to open it up at that point.
I mean, Greg, one of the things which I do on a day-to-day basis with colleague James Nason and others in Instinctive Partners, we try and make sense of the political commentary, explain it to clients, explain it to businesses and organisations. And Sir Paul earlier spoke to the green light, I suppose, being given by Irish Taoiseach, Prime Minister, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, that let's look at alternative arrangements. if I was giving that hard advice to a client, I would say, well, let's look at the paragraph before that, which really was Brexit is an unmitigated disaster. We wish it never happened. We wish the British people didn't vote how they did, but we're not going to interfere in it. So let's not pretend that Dublin necessarily wants alternative arrangements. I think Dublin wants the UK never to leave. Okay? That's the want. It's not a political reality because the people have voted. However, the conversation around what alternative arrangements can look like are really, really useful, because all of a sudden you get to have a conversation that says, ignore the political rhetoric for a moment and look at the EU treaties, the Acts of Parliament, the UN conventions, the Good Friday Agreement. Let's look at this. And as Shanka was talking about earlier on, what it reminded me was that was the conversation that was perhaps needed in March, April, and May in 2016 from people like you to say this is more complex than the political statement of leave or remain. Because in Ireland we've lots of experience of Russia's two-hold referenda that ultimately governments got bloody noses on. Famously in 2013, the then Taoiseach Enda Kenny, with a huge parliamentary majority, decided it was a good idea to get rid of one of the houses of Parliament, the Senate, because, quote unquote, we have too many politicians. And it caught the imagination of the public, as these things do. If you ask the public, do you want less regulation? Do you want less interference from a foreign body? All the things that were proposed, you will get a very resounding yes, we don't want more regulation and we don't want these things. But thankfully, I and others were part of a campaign, not because we loved the Senate, but because we thought it was a dangerous thing for a government with a huge majority to withdraw another check and balance from that parliamentary procedure. So I suppose the context for this is a question earlier on, was it from Lisa, is the politics of all of this is often missed because the Dublin government and the opposition parties in Dublin speak with one voice on this. So we're not hearing divergent views from Dublin. Don't think a change of government or a change of Prime Minister or Taoiseach in Dublin would change the position in Dublin. It would not change one dot. So that's my resounding message to all of you in this context.
Okay, thank you.